I made this coffee table back in early 2009, and considering I made it in my first apartment with virtually no tools, it's remarkable that it's lasted this long. Overall, I've been pretty happy with the design of it. I've always felt that the size of it was just about right for the two of us, who often sit on the sofa doing things with their computers. But it's also good for putting drinks on, obviously, or books, or drawing post-it notes on, and it's also the right height for kicking your feet up on it as well. Over the past couple of years, I began thinking that it might be time to replace it though. As satisfied as I am with the size and the general design of it, there's plenty that I'm not satisfied with about it, but most of it comes down to workmanship and materials. After getting the DIY store to cut down the plywood to my specifications, I think I built this with just like a handsaw and a drill, so there's no joinery in it at all. It's pretty badly made, and accordingly, one of the legs has snapped off multiple times, and another two are pretty wobbly now as well. Because it's just whatever plywood they had at the shop, it has uneven veneers and these massive voids in it that have always really annoyed me. And the structure of it is made out of these plain 2x2s, which are pretty embarrassingly warped now that I look at it with higher standards. The other thing that bothers me about it is that though the lower shelf is really useful for storing stuff, it really sags because there's nothing but these tiny little brackets supporting it. So when I started taking the idea of rebuilding it a little bit more seriously, I began thinking maybe I should just rebuild it out of hardwood and do some nice joinery, like some double mitre joints on the corners. And I figured if I was going to use hardwood, I should probably use some birch ply for the top and bottom, because it's the only plywood I'm aware of that has even laminations and minimal voids. I started poking around at this idea a little bit more seriously before Christmas, and I got a little bit put off by the idea because the timber yard that I usually order my hardwood from wanted an extortionate amount of money to throw a sheet of birch plywood in the order, more than it would have cost to even pay for a second delivery from a more reasonably priced company. I put the idea back on the back burner, just like it had been for the past couple of years, and then over Christmas I got infected by an idea. It crossed my mind that it wouldn't use up anywhere close to an entire sheet to just make these two surfaces. So I began thinking, what if I used the rest of the sheet to build the rest of the structure as well? The idea pursued me for a little while, and I started thinking it was actually quite a good one. So I sucked it up and ordered a new sheet of 12mm birch ply and went down to the workshop. I gave the sheet a good once over once we got it down into the workshop, and I felt like I'd won the plywood lottery because despite this being a BBBB sheet, it didn't have a single plug in it on either side. This had the potential to make my life a lot easier as I didn't have to work around anything particularly silly to get nice faces for the shelves. So what my plan amounted to for this project was to glue some of the plywood together to make thicker sheets, eventually making timber that was as thick as what I wanted. To do a good job of this though, I had to rotate every other sheet of plywood that I stuck together to keep the pattern in the end grain consistent. I decided which corner looked the best to save for my tops, and then I took the jump and made the first cuts in the sheet. I had this long piece left over in one direction, which was about the perfect size because I needed several pieces that were that length and it was the same width as the board. So I cut a slice off of the other edge in a perpendicular direction. I got some glue out and remembered that it moves a lot easier if it's warmed up a little bit first, and then I stuck the two sheets together. I guess I was originally imagining that my laminations wouldn't be that thick, and I could just clamp them down to glue them together. But once I was looking at this sheet, even before I glued it up, I realised it was probably going to be a bit wide to get consistent pressure with just some clamps. I improvised quickly and realised that I had all of the bricks from the conservatory project sitting outside the workshop door, so I brought loads of those in and piled them all up. I put what I felt like was enough bricks on, and then I had a look underneath the plastic sheet, and it looked like it was going to work really well, so I left it to dry overnight. I was pretty delighted that it seemed to work really well when I removed all the bricks in the morning. I needed 2 beams of wood that were twice the thickness of the sheet of plywood, so I trimmed those off first, and then I cut what was left in half to double up again for my other 2 long pieces that I needed, and glued those together. They were a bit narrower, so I went to town a bit more with the clamps, but I still wasn't confident, so I threw a load more bricks on the top and left it to dry again for another day. I got the first couple of full thickness beams sliced up, and I realised that my table saw wasn't really going to get me a clean enough cut for the job, as even when doing a lighter pass to try and clean it up, it left me with some scorching. I began thinking about what to do about this problem, and my first thought was maybe like a planer thicknesser, but I'm aware of the conventional wisdom that passing end grain through a planer thicknesser is probably a bad idea, so I knocked that idea on the head. I figured that the right tool for the job would probably be a drum sander, but after looking around on the internet, this seemed like too niche a tool to be able to hire it just for a quick job like I was trying to do. So I decided I didn't really have anything to lose by looking up a few local carpentry companies and daring to ask them if they had a drum sander that they'd be willing to pass some material through for me. I looked for companies that seemed to have premises rather than just being single people like me, out of hopes that they would have such a big tool. And I was really pleasantly surprised when a local firm called HCS replied to my email saying, "Sure, give us a call and you can pop down." The power of just willing to ask is amazing sometimes. So I pressed on with getting my materials ready to pass through their drum sander. At this point I was all too happy to get all of these horrible old bricks out of my workshop, as they were leaving old cement absolutely everywhere and it was driving me nuts. I used my clamp guide to give me a reference straight edge on my final glue up, and then cut a new straight edge onto it, which I could then glue a scrap of timber onto, because I wasn't really sure if there was going to be risk that the drum sander would take a little bite out of it at the end of it rolling through. I've never used one before, and I was running a little bit tight on the amount of length I had in this timber. But once that glue had set up, I cut all my necessary battens, including one extra one just in case, and popped down the road to get them sanded. They had such a cool workshop and I was really jealous of it. I was expecting their drum sander to maybe be the size of my table saw, but freestanding and on legs of its own, but their machine was an absolute beast. It probably would have taken up half of my entire workshop. But they very kindly took my stock for me and passed it through their machines, and boy was it the right tool for the job. It got such a nice finish and I was so pleased with it. I was so glad to have asked, and even more glad that they bothered replying to me. So thank you HCS Furniture, that was amazing. I got my newly cleaned up timber home, and it looked so nice I realised that I was going to have to step up my game a bit for my joinery to live up to how nice these came out. This made for a bit of a detour in making a new cross-cutting sled with an accurate 45-degree angle on it. I found the easiest way of securing the rails onto the underside of a scrap of timber was to leave the rails in place and screw it from underneath on the back and the front of the table saw, and that worked really well. I made a makeshift fence and then dared to cut through the sled, and then I made the hypothetical 45-degree angle fence, which included this little countersink to allow me to adjust it finally before I secured it down. I made this fence out of a scrap of MDF, and that was kind of a bad idea. I was going for flatness, but MDF is just so terrible these days that I didn't really notice how much it bulged out until after I did my first cut. In spite of the bulge, I was pretty surprised at how accurate I got this first cut. I think I measured it to be about 0.2 degrees out of square, which was probably acceptable woodworking, but I just didn't trust that I'd get consistent results with that bulge. So I rebuilt the fence, this time out of a bit of plywood with the MDF on the front for the smooth surface. My system worked really well considering I was just following my nose making this sled, and I got it really satisfyingly accurate. I figured that before I cut any more though, I should probably start with the glue up and see how it goes. I started going at this with all multitude of clamps and silliness, which did kind of work, and I got it glued up nicely, but it seemed like it was much more effort than it needed to be. When the glue was all set up though, it did look nice and square, so I took all the clamps off and proceeded with the rest of the legs. I realised that I was totally overcomplicating it when I tried to clamp it all together, and the answer was to just use a bit of masking tape and mostly rely on gravity. And it worked really well. Once the glue had set up on these inverted U-shapes that I had for each end of the table, my next port of call was strengthening them. There's no way I was going to rely on just glue and a 45-degree mitre to make it stronger than it was before. And because the plan with my design was to put an entire piece of timber on top of the structure to make the table itself, I had a little bit of wiggle room to hide some reinforcements. I got some 9mm dowel and braved drilling through the joint to insert the dowel and reinforce it. It was really quite fascinating when I was brute forcing the dowels into the joints, because it was so tight that the glue started seeping out of the edge of the end grain of the plywood, which was really interesting and curious. Gladly it didn't make too much of a mess though, and I noticed it every time. Once the glue had set, the reinforcements seemed to have worked really nicely, and these end pieces were really nice and strong, so I could start focusing on putting the whole structure together. The leg structures had gone so well that the next thing I had to decide was what to do about the cross braces. My ambition was to do a double mitre joint on them, but I began wondering if this was going to be another episode in the art of knowing when to stop. And I began wondering whether I should just do it as a butt joint and not risk making a mess of it somehow. I thought about it and I realised that I could do the joinery on these cross braces at least, with minimal risk, because if I was doing a butt joint I would just cut this joinery off anyway. I cut more 45-degree mitres on the table saw, and then cut a perfect straight line 3/4 of the way through on the back as well. I then used the laminations of the plywood as a guide to chisel out some of this material until I was left with only the face quarter. With this done on all four corners of the braces, I could begin getting a feel for how this table was going to look. And it was looking so good that I decided I had to try and do these mitre joints. The way I figured to do it was to score a knife line on the legs following the mitre I cut on the long pieces. These legs were now such a funny shape that I really wasn't brave enough to try and cut these mitres on the table saw, so I armed and ahed and I ended up doing it with a handsaw and cleaning up with a chisel. This also went alright, perhaps better than I expected. Well enough in fact that I decided I'd better go and get my good camera out and take some nice footage of me doing this joinery work by hand. Now I'd sold myself on these mitre joints and done the joinery accordingly, the next thing to do was to prepare the way for the lower shelf. The idea I had for reinforcing this lower shelf was to build a cross brace underneath, kind of like a stretcher that you would get on a chair leg, and make that out of the plywood that I'd cut earlier, but turning it 90 degrees so it'd be nice and strong. I did some scale drawings in my computer to get me a rough idea of the angles that I needed, and then I worked out how much to chisel out of these legs, which also felt like a huge leap of faith, because I was so worried about ruining these things that had come out so well. I did the first one and made an absolute meal of it, completely overthinking how I should be chiseling this material out. But after I did a couple more, I began getting the hang of it, and again decided to get the nice camera out to get a better shot of it. I then cut my stretcher to approximate length, and then used the disc sander to help me get an accurate angle that would slot into these notches neatly. I know this was my idea all along, but it felt kind of crazy to be relying on these tiny little notches to support an entire shelf. But I had to remind myself how little actually supports your average kitchen shelf and how much weight usually sits on those as well, so I decided this was totally sufficient. Now these notches were cut and I was convinced it was going to work, it was time to glue those mitre joints together. This ended up being a bit of a palaver that I deliberately didn't really record, in which I was kind of chasing the glued up joints around the table a couple of times. but I managed to get it assembled and acceptably square, so I was pretty happy with the end result. The next thing to do was to finally come around to these surfaces. I cut that final sheet into two and chose which one was nicest for the top. And then began trying to sneak up on the fit of it. This was much easier with the circular saw because I wasn't quite convinced that the top was all in square. And even when I got it cut down to the right size, there was still a little bit of an inaccuracy that I was worried about, in which my beams weren't as perfectly straight as perhaps I'd hoped. Doing the lower shelf was even harder because I had to basically run with the assumption that what I'd made was square enough before I cut these corner notches out. And I think I also went about this in a bit of a ridiculous way. But I did get it together, and with a little bit of tweaking that lower shelf went in as well. And I could begin seeing what the whole structure looked like. Once I'd cut the top to size, I discovered that in spite of all of my protestations about birch plywood being pretty void free, I happened to hit what I guess was a knot and therefore a pretty big void in this top surface of wood. I decided I couldn't live with it, and figured that I was competent enough to try and splice a patch in. I didn't really want to do the splice, so it went out and was visible in the face. So I got my tiniest chisel and carved out what I think was 4 laminations surrounding this void, before sanding down a new piece to slot in, making sure I got the orientation of the grains the right way, before gluing and pressing in and leaving that to dry. When the glue dried, I trimmed it back and it was looking pretty promising. I wasn't brave enough to try and use a planer on this, so I went at it just with my power sander and some good quality sandpaper, and it got a really amazing finish. I was so surprised at how good a job I'd done of this patch. I totally didn't think I was going to get it this good. It's just a little bit of a shame that the colours of the wood don't quite match, but it looks way better than the void did. I had to keep the project moving forward, so I glued the top onto the legs and clamped it all down before leaving it for a day to set up nicely. While the glue was setting up, I thought about this overhang situation. I figured a router with a follow-along bit would probably be the right tool for the job, but I really didn't trust old Mr. Hitachi to not do a bad job and end up with me burning something. With how well sanding out that void patch went with just my power sander, I decided that I didn't really have much to lose from just trying to sand that edge smooth. And it took a little bit of work, but it worked really well. I had one other problem that I needed to figure out. Disappointingly, but not really surprisingly, when I was hand chiseling the second miter joints, I ended up losing a tiny fragment of the end material, which left some little gaps that needed filling in. I wasn't too worried about it after my experience with the upstairs floorboards, in which I discovered that coloured pencils are actually really good for blending the colour in filler before putting finish on it. I masked the area off and filled it, left it to dry, sanded it back, and then got the pencils out. This ended up looking pretty damn good as well. It definitely wasn't a big enough problem to make me wish I hadn't done the double miter joints. The last thing I had to figure out about this project were these cross braces under the shelf. I thought about doing them as a half lap joint, but my instincts told me that was a really bad idea, as that would make these braces so much weaker at exactly their weakest point already. And I decided I would rather just have one solid brace, and have the other 2 pieces of the cross just attached to that one. Again, I used the drawings on my computer to give me a rough idea of what angle these needed to be. So I cut them down and sanded them down until they fit good enough, and trial and error the angles to try and get these 2 cross braces parallel. I consulted with Lily and she agreed that this was an episode in the art of knowing when to stop, so I left them here because it looked really good anyway, and I doweled them together. So after more sanding and more sanding, it was time to finally put some finish on it. I found that what finish to put on it was a little bit of an arbitrary decision, because our old coffee table was finished with just whatever I found at the DIY store again. It was nothing remarkable, and it held up really nicely for the past 17 years, so I don't think anything was going to be particularly bad for it. I ended up deciding on using some dead flat polyurethane, like I used on the bench out in our porch, because I think that looked really good. The bottle said 2 to 3 coats, but I ended up going 5 or 6 before it stopped seeming like it was just absorbing into the wood. It was quite funny working through it though, because with this dead flat finish, it looked almost like there was nothing on it. And it wasn't until I picked up the scrap that I had left over from the project and compared it to the finish that I'd now achieved, that I realised how good it actually looked. Once the finish had had a couple of days to cure properly, I did the final assembly of the lower shelf, and Lily helped me carry it down to the living room.
Cool.
So it might be a bit of a silly use of an entire sheet of birch plywood, but I am really pleased with it. It's really interesting to see how much my woodworking has come along in the past 17 years. And I'm really glad that I did the double mitre joints as well. Mitre joints are kind of a funny thing because you don't really notice how much effort goes into something that looks so simple. I'd imagine to the average person, this just looks like how the wood was meant to be joined together. They would have no idea how much work actually went into getting it so accurate. As well as liking how it looks, I think I've managed to fix all of the problems that I had with the old one as well. It's so much more stable and has none of the flaws of the old material either. And there was even a lesson in there about the power of being willing to ask for help. So thank you for watching along with me as I figured out how to make this thing and, keep it real.